We often hear that diversity, equity, and inclusion matters to businesses, but their data tells a different story. So what is the missing piece? On Finding Diversity, we tell real stories of what has worked for others and provide experiences that will inspire you. I'm Justus Thompson, and this is where our journey begins. Welcome back to Finding Diversity, the Missing Piece. Today, we have the privilege of hosting Simran Jeet Singh, the Executive Director of Aspen Institute and author of The Light We Give, How Sikh Wisdom Can Transform Your Life. Simran is a renowned scholar and advocate for religious pluralism, dedicated to driving civic change by disrupting bias and fostering empathy. He brings a wealth of expertise to our conversation. Join us as we delve into Simran's journey and insights into promoting diversity and inclusion. I'm your host, Justus Thompson. Let's get started. Simran, thank you for being here.
For sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, of course. I have to say, I am super excited for this. Honestly, also a little nervous. I think this is one of the conversations that I'm the most excited for, but also nervous because I don't have a depth of knowledge when it comes to Sikh. And when I was looking you up and doing a lot of research, I was like, man, all of this stuff is very interesting and somewhere where I don't feel like I have a whole lot of depth of knowledge. So I'm really excited for today's conversation and for our listeners. So
yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. And I know this is like the kinds of stuff, specifically, where I come from and the tradition I practice is new for a lot of people. But I know in general, like in this country, we don't talk so much about religion, and we don't really know how to approach it sometimes. So I'm excited to.
Yeah, religions and politics, right? The two things you can never bring up at dinner room conversation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, we like starting with this Cape U exercise. There's three things. So one, you can pick. You can do one short response to any of these, or you can respond to all of them. Just pick. I'll go first. It can be one thing about your younger self, one thing you like about your culture, or something unique about you. So I'll go first. And one thing that I like about my younger self, or maybe unique about me, is I really like poetry. And one of my favorite poems is by Langston Hughes. And it was a response to a poem called I Hear America Singing. And the poem that I really respond to is I Too Sing America, which was this beautiful response to this poem that essentially talked about what it was to be in the American dream and feeling like he was left out. And, one of my favorite lines that always stuck out to me is he talks about kind of the idea of being ignored when company comes, being sent to the back room to eat and grow strong. But he kind of ends it with saying, tomorrow I will be at the table and they'll be aghast because they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. And I thought it was such a beautiful, and I think it came to me at a time where I really was struggling with my identity and anger and like feeling like nobody understood what I was going through or what it was to be Black in America. And I feel like those words really, really spoke to me. I cried the first time I read it. It was just a beautiful poem, but it's fantastic. And with that said, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say, I'm a huge Langston Hughes fan. I'm so excited that you said that. So that'll be my share too. So I didn't really hear about Langston Hughes until college. And then I took a course on the Harlem Renaissance. And then through the Harlem Renaissance course, I took a seminar on Langston Hughes and I just fell in love with his poetry. I mean, everything, even now, I mean, it's one of those things where like, what he was writing about 100 years ago, but everything he says is still true. And so, I mean, there's something about our society and what progress looks like and the things we struggle with. But he had this ability to just say things in ways that were so simple and clear, and you would hear it and you'd be like, oh, hell yeah. Like, that's exactly what I feel, but nobody's ever said that before. And I just remember thinking like, how could it be that this guy, 80 years ago then, but 100 years ago now, how could he be sitting there and having the same feelings and experiences that I do sometimes? And how can he say them better than me? Like, it's such a gift. So yeah, I'm a huge Langston Hughes fan. So I'm excited that you shared that.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's funny. I love that you love Langston Hughes too. I ran into it in college as well. in Harlem Renaissance. I had a class on Harlem Renaissance, W.B. Du Bois, all that era of stuff that I read, and he was one of the ones that stood out. I remember we read a poem, obviously, in class, or like had an assignment where we had to read a couple, and literally as soon as I read it, I went out and bought like his collection
Yeah,
of
same,
poems and just
same.
sat
Yeah,
down and read them all. It was
that's so
fantastic.
cool.
It was
Yeah.
fantastic. Well, with that said, I think that's a beautiful segue into kind of, it feels like we haven't come that far, right? Like we just talked about Langston Hughes speaking a message that seemed like 80 years ago, right? To today. Talk to me about that. Like what is the landscape right now, and why does it not feel like we haven't gone very far?
Yeah, it's funny because, like, on the one hand, it does feel like we've made a lot of progress, and things have definitely changed, right? Like with the civil rights movement, we
Yeah.
have all sorts of movement and um, changes that help us see, um, societally, that help us see one another differently, treat one another differently, and, like, as a historian, that feels good. Like that's really important to recognize, and in some ways, I don't think we celebrate it enough. And then at the same time, and I say this also as a historian, like our tendency to assume that as time moves forward, we are also moving forward socially and politically. Um, like that doesn't ring true for me. Like there are so many moments historically where we've taken big steps backwards and struggled with things that I thought we might have already figured out, and it feels like we're in one of those moments of regression, where, I mean, honestly, it's hard for a lot of people in this country right now um, to do that really simple thing that Langston Hughes was talking about, and the simple thing that I talk to my little kids about, which is like, be nice to people and and see their humanity and
Yeah.
treat them well, and don't be a jerk, and like it's all at the end of the day like a simple singular message, and for whatever reason, like it feels like we're spinning our wheels, it feels like we're going backwards, it feels like it's like, what's that, like you're banging your head against the wall and
Yeah.
like not getting anywhere. And so, um yeah, it's both, and it's like, um it's good and it's positive, and we can celebrate it, and at the same time it's just so frustrating. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I see it right now.
I think it's such a beautiful thing you said, because I think for me, I do think I don't celebrate enough how far we've come, the strides we've made, and some of the things that I don't have to deal with that my grandfather or my father had to deal with that now are better for me. But I think there's something you said in there that I think is so beautiful, and I wonder if you're quoting or talking about Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he talks about the concept of time, and that time isn't secular in nature, that good isn't guaranteed to win. It's that it's an action, right? That you have to engage in that change in order for it to move. So I think that's something that's very beautiful. How can people, our listeners, engage in that change, right? That, because I think it's easy to look back and see a lot of times Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement and feel like, okay, what's left, or even to acknowledge, wow, I think it is really important. I'll just use women as an example. I think it is really important that women are paid fairly and experience the workforce in an equitable way. How can people engage in that?
Mm. Yeah, there's so much we can talk about, and people like us talk about these things all day, every day, and so it's like, um, talk is cheap sometimes. It feels like, and as I'm thinking about Langston, and I'm thinking about Dr. King, and I was reading that letter for a seminar just last week, and absolutely, it's on my mind. One of the things I see in people like them, like just like luminaries, is also this thing that we don't do so well right now. And I'll say this like in a way that's kind of a direct critique of the effort, and that is, we're so focused on making social change, which I think is crucial, right? Like that's what the game is right now. But we're focused on systems and institutions, and how do you change culture? How do you change the environment? How do you change the conversation? How do you make sure all these big macro level things? And so often the thing we totally forget is sitting right in front of us, right? It's ourselves. And I look at people who are like the transformative leaders who are actually effective in making this change, who are able to speak in a way like Langston, like Dr. King, who they were able to speak in a way that like captured truth, because I think they were in tune with truth in a way that a lot of us aren't, right? Where like it's very momentary, it's what's hot right now. Let's use a bunch of buzzwords, right? Like that's kind of how we
I
how
don't
we
want to be wrong, right? Like I'm interested in this. It's hot right now. I don't want to be wrong, but yeah,
totally,
for sure.
totally. So like to your question, I think it's like what I'm looking at when I'm looking at these figures, and I mean, frankly, I think about this stuff sometimes, but I don't always talk about it in this way. But just like the way that our conversation started, like it seems obvious to me that one really important avenue for change is ourselves, and we might sit here and be like, well, that's not enough, and that's not going to change the world. And I think the reality is that's where it begins, and like you can't really go out there and tell other people what to do if you're not living into it personally, right? That creates hypocrisy and tension, and things fall apart really quickly, as we've seen. So yeah, that's I think where my head is right now in terms of how we drive that change.
I think that's such a great point. I think, especially what you said about leaders, and in combination with it starts with you. Like when people always ask, because I think when people ask those questions, a lot of times what they're really asking is, "What's the quick fix? Give me a list of 10 things of the things I can and cannot call people. Give me the list of things I can and cannot do, and then boom, we'll be able to do it." But it's not that simple. Like relationships and interactions are multifaceted, and they have this complexity of humanity that comes into it. And I think there's a beautiful synergy here. Of it just made me think of The Office of all things. I'm a huge Office nerd. Love The Office. Very first episode, or like the second episode, is like Diversity Day, and the whole episode essentially that Steve Carell goes in and makes a Chris Rock joke in everyone, and that's why they had to show up. And the whole diverse thing is just for him for telling that joke. I think the important thing to remember is context, right? The reason why Chris Rock could tell the joke and it was funny is because he's a comedian on stage. And the reason Michael Scott couldn't is because he's not a comedian on stage, and this isn't really a space for that. So I think when people ask for the one fix of like, what's that one thing we can do? It's not, it's context. And you might have a relationship with someone or a friend that you can tell that joke to. But I can't give you a blank statement to say, hey, in all circumstances, this can't be it. So I really, really resonate with what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like we have more in common than I thought we would coming in. It's
Yeah.
like we hit the Harlem Renaissance. Now we're hitting TV shows, and yeah, we're two for two so far.
Yeah, which is fantastic. The one thing I want to jump into um, is your book, right? The light we give and how Sikh wisdom can transform your life. What does that mean?
Yeah, the title of the book. I struggled with the title for a long time, and a lot of writers I know struggle with their titles because it's got to be perfect, right? You got to capture like all the pages of the book in like 10 words. So it was tough, but ultimately, what I wanted to say, and I was starting to think of it as like, what's the essence of the book? Like, what's my main message? And the main message, it sort of goes back to something we were talking about earlier, which is, um, I want people to know and to feel that they have this inherent light inside of them. And this is what my tradition teaches. And I find that to be such a powerful way to address some of the hierarchies we create in society, right? Like we'll say, I'm better than you because of this, or you're better than me because of this. And, when we start thinking about ourselves as these embodiments of light, then we're like, oh, we're like all ultimately we have this same shared experience, and we're connected to one another, and that I think was really important. And the other thing I wanted to say was like it's not just it's not just something that we choose to give off. Like, we're always illuminating the world around us, whether we realize it or not. And I want people to know that they have that power. I share this Punjabi folktale, excuse me, this Punjabi folktale at the beginning of the book about a lantern, and the sun is setting, and the sun is setting, and everyone's freaked out because they're like, it's going to get dark and we're going to have no light and nobody knows what's going to happen when the sun sets. And one lantern just lifts up its wick and says, I'm going to challenge the darkness, and we'll see what happens. And I think it's that kind of self-awareness that doesn't require a feeling of supremacy, right? It's not about being better than others or having more light than others. It's just like, hey, we have this. Like, it's the confidence that comes with an awareness of who we actually are, and that to me was in many ways like the core idea that I'm trying to share with people through the book.
I think that's so important. To me, what I hear, if I'm trying to regurgitate it and make sure I'm getting the essence of what's there, to me, what I would relate that to is, I think a lot of times when we go through life, we never question the personal motivations behind the particular decisions or why we engage in a particular manner. It reminds me a lot of when I was in college. I went to football at a very Christian, conservative school, which is not at all how my personal views happen to be. One of the reasons I went there is because I was like, well, if I truly hold these things, I better hold them in this type of environment. Plus they're playing for me to play football, right? So to be completely transparent, they pay for me to come play football. I'm gonna come play football. But I had a lot of conversations, especially with my coach, and other people around the university, that were very conservative and had kind of these ideologies that I didn't necessarily agree with, but were great people. They had, to your extent, now that you say this, I feel like they had a lot of light inside of them, and we didn't have to agree on things, but I could tell there was a light, and I would challenge them. We'd have great discussions, but at the end of the day, what I feel like came out of that was an understanding of themselves. Like, sometimes I could see in the midst of us having a conversation, them realizing, actually, I don't know why I hold that belief. I remember there were several students that ended up becoming my best friends, that while we were having conversations, like, I remember one of my best friends, we were just in a wedding together. He was another best man, said to me, well, I was just, in the locker room, had Chicago Bulls hat. Derrick Rose was there at the time, or recently. So I was a big Derrick Rose fan. And he just said, passing by, he was a white guy. He was like, so do you actually like the Bulls, or are you just black? And I just thought, I was like, seriously? And so I addressed it right there, right? And just said, look, like, what are you doing? Like, that's completely racist. Like, let's have a conversation, whatever, let it pass. And then through that, we had several follow-up conversations, because he was extremely apologetic, was like, look, like, I don't really whatever. And through that, became friends, right? Like, it wasn't like he said that, I was, oh, it's all good. Like, but I think part of that is, a lot of times, if you don't engage with these, you never question, you never have anybody pushing back on you. It becomes very difficult to move forward, or very difficult to kind of assess those things. And when I hear you, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like the book really kind of shines that and lets people understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a good example. And I have so many similar experiences. Part of what I'm sharing in my book is, like, I grew up in Texas, in South Texas. My family, my brothers and me, were the only ones wearing turbans down there. And so, racism was constant. I mean, it wasn't every day, but it was pretty close. And, and we had to figure out pretty early, like, how are we going to deal with this without being angry all the time, or like, other people's negative comes to you and it's so easy to take that in and spit it right back out, right? and
Yeah.
and I tried that, and I just wasn't happy. Like, it wasn't satisfying to me when we had to figure out a different way to deal with people. And this philosophy, it came in really handy for me. And when I was writing the book, I was really inspired. um, I started writing in 2016, and I felt like the country was falling apart, and all my friends were talking about, I can't sit at Thanksgiving dinner with my family anymore because we don't get along, or I hate my dad and I don't talk to him anymore. And I'm like, man, that's
It's rough.
brutal. Like
Yeah.
I hear you on, you know, the difficulty of getting along with people who see the world differently from you. Like that's hard for me too, but like it doesn't have to be so extreme, and it doesn't have to be so painful. Like there are
Yeah.
ways to, it's one of the things you said. I was in a conversation with some of my favorite memoirists. We were talking about writing our books, and so we all sort of talked about our lives, and it was Kwame Alexander, who's black, Javier Zamora, who is undocumented and came to this country as a child, and me. And at the end of it, Kwame said this really cool thing that I haven't forgotten. He said, I feel closer to myself because, like, I feel closer to you because I know your story, but I actually feel closer to myself because I know your story. And like, I've been thinking about that a lot because I notice that works for me too. Like, as I get to know other people, this is sort of what you were describing. It's not just about looking outward and feeling connected to people I don't know, which is really important, but it actually helps me understand myself better. And I think that's a really beautiful way to grow in this world.
That just gave me chills, like literal chills down my body. That was a lot of energy. That was awesome. The one thing that also makes me think of is I think there are moments in history that we experience that are full of trauma for everyone. I think one of the biggest ones, and I saw a video of you talking about this, was 9/11. Talk to me about that and how it was going through that, especially in Texas in the South.
Yeah, I mean, it was in a lot of ways. I think you could probably imagine. And if you're listening and you don't see me, like I wear a turban, I have brown skin, I have a beard, and you know, from the day of 9/11, my life sort of changed immediately, and I went from being seen as someone who was different or foreign or an outsider, however people saw me, and like that came with its own problems and challenges. But now I was seen as people's enemy, and people were angry, understandably. People were upset, understandably. They were hurt, understandably, and a lot of times their feelings were channeled towards me and people who look like me. So it was, I mean, it was really confusing in a lot of ways. As in, I was 18. I was trying to figure out my own life, and now all of a sudden, I had to figure out how to deal with other people seeing me in a way that didn't match up with how I saw myself, and that's a hard thing. And I think, you know, I my experience of it was extreme, right? Like not all of us are
Mhm.
seen as enemies, but all of us deal with people's judgments. We know that people are assuming things about us all the time based on how we look or what we wear or what language we, I mean, what
Mhm.
accent we have. I mean, there's so much that people are judging about us. And so um, that period, I mean, it was scary for a while with the death threats we were getting at home and that kind of thing. But I think one of the biggest lessons for me coming out of it was understanding that you can't control how people see you, and you can't tie your happiness to their judgment or their assumptions, because if you do that, and so many of us do, right? And um, you know, my life, it might have been that particular issue, but like with social media, you know, with the ways that we're thinking about beauty standards, I mean, there's so many reasons why we're so focused on what other people think about us, and realizing, I think for a lot of marginalized folks, we have to learn this, um, that if we keep focusing on other people's perceptions of us, like we're just stuck. Like there's nowhere to
Yeah.
go with that. And ultimately, we have to find a way to be happy with ourselves and be proud of who we are. And I think that that's a different kind of inner work. That's it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey, but it's the only way out, I think.
I think it's such a good point, and I think it's so hard to find like your own center and be proud of like who you are as a person and in all of your identity and aspects of your identity. And I think to what we were talking about before, I think as well is like talking to other people makes it easier. I think I remember talking to one of my friends in high school, who was Middle Eastern. His name was Vishnu. Shout out Vishnu. Still good friends now. But we were just having kind of a funny conversation. He was like, "Man, it is so rough looking like me." And I talked about being black, and like we went to a predominantly white school, and we just talked about our experience. I remember it was after we were playing basketball. We would go down to the rec, play basketball for an hour or so, and then we would, chill and talk for a while. And I remember just talking and having it just massively expand my experience of also not feeling alone. Like I felt like he understood aspects of what it meant for me, and I feel like he felt like he had someone who he could vent to and talk to, and it just made it easier. Like like it wasn't like all of the things that we were going through disappeared after that conversation. But to your point of like light, like it felt like there was a light because I could look in the darkness. There was someone else who could relate, and I think those type of things are just so incredibly important.
Yeah, so important. And it's like, I don't know. It's this funny thing about racism. I mean, we often talk about racism as like divide and conquer strategy, right? Like they make you feel like um, you're competing against one another, and then that competition turns toxic, right? And it's true. Like that's part of what happens. But one of the things we don't talk about is how that divisive approach then results in feelings of isolation. Like I remember, I mean, it's so funny because like I knew so many people from different kinds of minoritized backgrounds growing up. Um, and I knew they had challenges, right? It's not like, I mean, it was Texas, it was the 90s, like things were rough. Um, but I never considered, I don't think, maybe I did, but like I don't recall considering that the challenges that I went to in terms of my own racism was in any way connected to theirs. And like, it's not just like back then we didn't talk about intersectionality. And so there was like this whole like, my community is my community and our challenges are our own. And you don't really talk about them. Um, but it was also like kind of what you were just describing right now. Like we knew about anti-black racism. We studied slavery in school. We knew about Jim Crow. Like it wasn't like I didn't know about that, but like I never looked at my black friends and were like, "Oh, you would understand what I'm going through if I told you." Like it didn't feel like they were comparable. And I think that feeling it was so hard to overcome. And eventually I realized that like there was actually liberation and community in recognizing that actually it's not just about you. You're not the only target and you don't have to figure it out yourself. So yeah, that was a really long process for me too.
I mean, it was funny how the conversation, like, and once again, this context is key. I say it here, and it may sound crass, but I think part of it was we talked about going into gas stations and being followed around in gas stations or going into stores and having people kind of like treat you like already like you're going to do something wrong. And I remember him saying casually, and I remember I've never forgotten this. And it was funny. It was just like off the hand comment, just like kind of a chuckle thing of like, he's like, I'm glad we could make it easier for black folks for a little while, like after that, which is like kind of like obviously not like a politically appropriate joke or whatever. But I remember it actually meaning something to me of like, you don't make that joke unless you understand the context. And I understood our relationship. And so that's what made the joke funny and something that wasn't just funny, but was meaningful to me of like, man, we can joke about this because we do have similar experience. And I think that's the fundamental joy of laughter. I think sometimes we forget that, especially when we look at comedy, is it's a release of a shared experience. That's why we can find it funny. And I think especially when you work in this field, everyone expects you not to laugh at Dave Chappelle or laugh at funny jokes when it's like, look, like I don't have to agree with what someone is saying or their political views to find what they're saying funny. Right. So I think it's one of those things that is really, really interesting in kind of this conversation we're having that just reminded me of. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. I think that's my experience too. That like, um, and I talk about this in my book too. Like to some degree, I think humor, like what you described, makes sense. And then humor for me has also been like a coping mechanism, like not just like in one sense, a coping mechanism for um, dealing with situations when they feel intense, like de-escalating in some ways.
Yeah.
Um, or like in my own head, like not having to deal with them. Um, but also like post facto, like the incident happens and you're with your friends and you're like, yeah, that was crazy. And you just start, like that kind of thing is really helpful too. So like as you're talking about like trauma and, you know, challenge and difficulty, like humor is actually a really important element in my own experience. And I know for a lot of people who share this experience too.
Yeah, it's so important. One of the things I also want to get your thoughts on, this is just like completely random, but I know you grew up in Texas. I grew up for a short time in Oklahoma, which isn't quite the South, but they definitely think they're the South. So I like to count it. But I remember growing up and there were white neighborhoods and there were black neighborhoods. And I remember when Obama won the election, and I was in school, I remember how mad even the kids were in some of the like venomous things coming out of like kids' mouth. And I must have been, I can't quite remember the grade. I must have been between sixth, like in eighth grade. But I remember like they were like sixth, fourth graders like saying the N word. Like, can't believe this, like just in class. And I remember like, because for me, it was a very different experience. I remember being like, holy crap, like a kid who looks like me, or someone who looks like me is president right now. And you imagine thinking that as a little kid and then going through and having everyone else have that type of reaction. Like it was crazy because my dad really pulled me out of school because it was that type of event. I feel like for me was like, yeah, like this doesn't happen every day. So I was wondering for you in the South, like what was it like? Like, what is it like? Because I also have friends who are from Texas, and I love them. Like, some of my best people, but they're also straight up. Like, I love like if the racist would tell you, like, look, I just don't like black people. Be like, why don't you like black people? Oh, well, one time I had this one time that a black guy cut me off in traffic, and that's why I don't like it. And then you're like, seriously? And they're like, yeah, I guess I shouldn't believe that anymore. I guess I won't. And then they're just done with it. Like, I'm like, I love their transparency.
That's so funny. Yeah, I'm trying to think through. Um, I think, sorry, for most of my life growing up. So I'll say in a lot of ways, like growing up was awesome. Like the people, and this sort of coming to your point about like, or at least something you were gesturing towards around relationships. Like when people get to know you, it's like, yeah, you're a normal person, and a lot of times, and the research shows this too, like the challenge comes when you don't have the opportunity to interact with people who are different from you, right? And you just see what you see on TV, or you hear stuff, or receive these stereotypes, and you're like, oh, I heard these people are like that, and that's the only data point you have. So I mean, I get how these biases are really crystallized and can become prejudice. And so like the people that I spent time with, like my friends at school, our neighbors, our teammates, like super tight, like it was, I mean, I'm trying to think if there was anything like that, like not within our friend circles. Like those were really trusted. But then it would be outside of that. And, there's all sorts of incidents and encounters where people would say stuff or not let us participate in things or deny us service or whatever. Like that would happen often too. But the interesting thing for me throughout all of this is, one of my friends said this to me once, and it was like I wasn't quite sure what to do. I don't write about this in the book, but it's like something that's always stuck with me. And my friend said this thing to me once when we were having like a deep conversation. It was like, I kind of forget that you wear a turban sometimes, and like, when you're like used to being sensitive to anybody making any comment about you, you're like
Yeah.
ready to be offended. And I was like, I feel like he's saying something that's like slightly offensive, but I don't know why. Like,
Yeah.
why do I want him to see my turban? And then like, is he trying to say there's something deeper? And like, definitely, I think in these conversations where we whitewash difference when we're talking about diversity,
Mhm.
then I'm like, no, look at my turban. Like it
Yes.
matters to me. I want you to see me for who I am. But also, and this is what my friend was trying to say, like him forgetting my turban was almost like a way of saying, I think what he was trying to say was, I see you for who you are as a person. And like, that's an aspect of your identity, but like, I'm not focused on it in the way that other people are. And like, I'm just thinking about you as a friend and not like you as a category of like, oh, you're a Sikh, or oh, you're Punjabi, or whatever it is that like people would associate with my turban. So like I've been thinking about that a lot recently, where like trying to figure out what's the right balance of like honoring people's identities and differences and like particular experiences, and at the same time going back to the shared light that we were talking about, right? Like looking deeper and being like, and at the end of the day, you're a human being, and that's something we all share. So yeah, that's a tough one to square sometimes.
I love that because I think to me, like the important thing about that comment, that what I hear is that's context. Like if someone comes to you on the street, and the equivalent for me is like, right, and probably for you as well is, well, I don't see color. Like we go we go have a conversation, right? Like that comment's not okay. But in that concept of like a close friend and a deep conversation and understanding, like you had the relationship to understand the deeper meaning of what he's trying to get, but he may not have the words for. And that's the difference of having that connection with someone and them saying something that may not be the right way. Someone like us who's been working in the field for a while would have said it, but being able to understand the meaning. And that's what I think for our listeners, if you say something wrong, understand that's not necessarily a reflection of who you are, but it might be a reflection of maybe you don't have the connection you think you do with those people for them to understand who you are, that you wouldn't make that.
Yeah. That's totally. No, I think that's so true. And like, of course, there are things you can say to your friends that you wouldn't say in public. Like
Yeah.
that's always the case, right? And like, there's a level of trust and understanding, and like even what you're saying before, like I'll make jokes with my friends based on shared experiences that I don't think people, or I don't assume that people outside would get, right? Like outside of
Yeah.
our circle of trust. Um, but definitely there's this like deep desire I feel to be like, oh, this thing that my friend was able to see, like I understand why it's so hard for people, and he was able to get there, and now I want to like activate that around the world. Like what would it look like for us to be able to do that, where they know you for who you are and respect you for who you are, but also can go beyond that, and really appreciate you for like the core of your being. And I think that's such a beautiful way to think about one another.
Well, I think that's a beautiful segue into our final question, which is, when we look at society, when we look at kind of the world in general, what is the missing piece in diversity of inclusion or in the world? We know there's not one missing piece. A lot of times there are several, but what is the one piece of advice that you feel like is missing that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I would focus in on something that we've been talking about a lot, and the single word for it is empathy. Um, the ability to see other people for who they are, rather than, and I think we're so bad at this, especially in the States. Like, um, we see everyone through our own lens and through our own experience, and it leads so quickly to judgment. It leads so quickly to us saying like, you're wrong and I'm right, or you haven't figured out how to do things in my way yet, and like, let me come save you, right? Like this colonizing mindset. And um, I, I I think even in the context of DEI, where we're talking about how do you resolve racial inequities, which is super important. Like, how do we talk about reparations? Super important. But one of the things that I feel like is missing in all of these conversations is that human element of care for one another, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
compassion for, and like what I talk to my kids about. And I think I try and bring this into my own life too, is like, if you don't have that at the core of what you're doing, like it so easily crumbles
Mm-hmm.
because it's not sustainable. But if you do have that at the core of what you're doing, then that love will fuel everything, right? That'll solve the problems. And I think figuring out how to infuse empathy into the really important work that everyone is out there doing in trying to build this world. I just feel like it's crucial in order to actually get to the finish line there.
Simran, that was absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for that. I feel like that's such a mic drop moment. That was absolutely fantastic. But to close it out, where can people find you? What events do you have coming up? How can people get in touch?
Yeah, I'm everywhere. I'm like online too much. On most social media, I'm Sikh Prof, SIKHPROF. On Twitter, I somehow managed to get my first name, which is a really popular South Asian first name, so I'm never giving that up. That's just Simran. Um, yeah, and then in terms of events, I'll be at South by again this year. I'll be in San Antonio for a big conference, and at the end of November, and that's I'm from there, so I'm going to be at pretty much all the Spurs games that are in town those 2 weeks. So come out to those Spurs game, come watch Wemby with me, come come cheer. Yeah, that's what I'll be up to.
Well, Simran, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Awesome. See you next time. Thank you for listening to Finding Diversity, the Missing Piece. You can expect new episodes monthly, and if you like the show, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. This helps others, like you, find the show. Finding Diversity, the Missing Piece, is powered by Cape Inclusion. It's produced by Studio D Podcast Production, directed by Prescott Wong, and hosted by me, Justus Thompson. To learn more about how you can get started and to book a demo, visit us at capeinclusion.com.